Hello, and welcome to day 11 of my class's plan to read and discuss Hamlet, a day in which I focus on my favorite scene in all of Shakespeare. I know you're not supposed to have your favorite children. If you have more than one child, you're not supposed to have favorites. And maybe English teachers aren't supposed to have favorite books. This is my favorite scene in all of Shakespeare for everything that I feel makes Shakespeare great, not the least of which um, his surprising sense of equality and the surprising nature of who gets to have power and influence and intelligence. Um, so I call this day the magical democracy of a graveyard, or how Hamlet gets home. We know that Hamlet is returning from his diplomatic trip to England, which was interrupted by pirates, and he's returning home, and he ends up he's with his friend Horatio here. The simple plot point, similar to his journey on the diplomatic mission, where we could have just not heard from him. Shakespeare has him meet a Danish soldier. We learn about a sort of pointless military excursion, which spurs Hamlet's final soliloquy. That pointless, seemingly pointless interaction led Hamlet to have this great last solo moment and reflection. Here, we could have had Hamlet just appear home, or I don't know, knock on the door, a servant shows up. And there's all different ways, obviously, to get Hamlet home. Here, they're walking through the graveyard near Elsinore Castle, and it's just one of the most amazing scenes ever. Now, I think it's important to be mindful that if you're in the theater watching this, and let's say you don't know the story Hamlet, we've just ended with that beautiful lyrical reflection by Gertrude on Ophelia's suicide, what seems to have been suicide. And then there's a pause. A couple of characters come out of the trap door at the Globe Theater, and they're sort of blue-collar guys. And Shakespeare's, I love this about him. Dickens has this in the world of novels too, this sense that there's high drama and upper class influence and kings and princes and leaders and the rise and fall of great people. And then there are regular folks too. And I may have mentioned this earlier, but when Juliet takes the potion and appears dead, she was supposed to get married that day. And Shakespeare knows that if there's going to be a wedding, there's going to be musicians. So he has these musicians show up to Juliet's family's home. And once they're told of her death, the musician's response is simply, I guess we'll play sad songs, like the gig change. That's it. Shakespeare knows that if Ophelia dies, just like when any character dies, there's going to be people whose responsibility is to dig the hole. And then some part of Shakespeare thought, wouldn't it be interesting to give these two guys their own scene, or at least the beginning of a scene? So here, not only are we in the churchyard, and it's clowns, but they're gravediggers, right? And they have shovels, and they're digging. And just like in any work environment, my students who have, sort of crappy retail jobs that they don't like, know that there's people in any workplace, doesn't matter what kind of workplace. There's folks who love sitting around talking, and there's folks who are super efficient who want to get the job done. So the first gravedigger says, is she to be buried in Christian burial that willfully seeks her own salvation? So willfully seeks her own salvation is just that gravedigger's interesting way of saying killed herself. So the first gravedigger begins asking, is this girl whose grave we're digging, is she going to get like a full Christian funeral if she killed herself? Because this is a long time ago, before people understood depression and despair and loss. And, Christianity saw suicide as the greatest sign of despair, which meant not trusting in the power and goodness of God, which was a great mortal sin. And you couldn't get a real funeral, a Christian funeral, if you killed yourself. So we leave the news, the beautiful description of Ophelia's tragic death, and then we're immediately debating her death. But the gravedigger is having the debate. She to be buried in Christian burial that willfully seeks her own salvation. And then we get the other kind of worker, again, that exists in your and my work environment. We have the truth on it. If this had not been a gentlewoman, she should have been buried at a Christian burial. So blunt. No, the only reason she's getting a Christian funeral is because she's from a rich, influential family. Who's kidding who? So this is the next moment, which is extraordinary. And what ends up happening with these two gravediggers is the first one goes on this long legalistic diatribe about the fact that Ophelia drowned, which isn't the same thing as killing herself. And he gives this like really funny attempt at like a legal defense for Ophelia, ends their little moment together with asking the second clown to go get booze, basically. So Hamlet and Horatio show up in the graveyard. So we have a gravedigger singing to himself, throwing old skulls out to make room for Ophelia. And Hamlet, who has been spending the entire play talking about death and immortality, this is the very first time where he saw a dead Polonius, but he hated Polonius, right? This is the first time he has seen like the decomposed bodies, the skulls of people. And he's looking at the gravedigger for whom this is just his job. He's not taking any of this personally, right? And he's tossing skulls out. And Hamlet says, that skull had a tongue in it. It could sing once. Hamlet's and Polonius and Horatio are kind of side stage. So the gravedigger's doing his own thing here. That skull had a tongue in it. It could sing once. How the knave jowls it to the ground as if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder. It might be the pate of a politician, which this ass now o'erreaches, or one that would circumvent God, might it not? And Hamlet goes on this long reflection of all the different kinds of people, the great buyer of land, and all these different, a courtier, and all these different people who these skulls could have been, right? But it is the first time Hamlet has seen skulls. And then we get one of the most remarkable interactions in all of literature. And I'll just little snippets. Hamlet approaches the gravedigger and uses the word sirrah, which is like dude, buddy. It's like you're lower than me and I get to call you this. Whose grave is this, sirrah? And the gravedigger says, mine, sir. And right, this is my good Lord Hamlet and my son, a little more than kin, less than kind. Would he read, my lord? Words. Where's Polonius? At supper. This is the clown here, the gravedigger, is playing Hamlet to Hamlet. Whose grave is this, sir? Mine, sir. And then he sings as if to say to Hamlet, I'm busy, I'm doing my thing. Oh, pit of clay for me to make such a guest as me. And Hamlet says, well, I think it be thine indeed, for thou liest in it. Hamlet goes along with the joke. But the gravedigger says, well, you lie out on it, sir, and therefore it's not yours. Well, for my part, I do not lie in it, yet it is mine. And Hamlet's good. Hamlet says, well, you do lie in it, because to be in it and say it's thine, it's for the dead, not for the quick. It's not for the alive. You're alive. It's for the dead. Therefore, you liest. So that's Hamlet playing with words. You do lie in it, but you're not lying in it like lying down. You're lying in it because you're telling lies in it. But the gravedigger's better than Hamlet. It's a quick lie search. Will away again from me to you. Hamlet knows he's defeated because he changes the subject. What man dost thou diggeth for? The gravedigger continues to be Hamlet. No man, sir. What woman then? For none, neither. Who is to be buried in it? You could see Hamlet getting exasperated. This is Hamlet for the first time is feeling what other people feel around Hamlet. Who's to be buried in it? Oh, one that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul, she's dead. Now, an interesting thing that I'm just now noticing after 25 years of teaching this is Hamlet does this blue-collar man the respect to ask him about his life. And it's like, I tell my students, it's like the CEO of a large corporation, asking a fast food employee, how long have you been working here? And how long does it take to make the French fries? And this doesn't happen, Fast food employees exist to give me the hamburger and the French fries as quickly as possible so I can leave, right? Hamlet, the prince, says to this guy with dirt under his fingernails, "How long have you been a grave maker?" And a little later, he asks him about his job. "How long will a man lie in the earth before he rots?" Hamlet is obsessed with death. This is the first time he's ever met someone who traffics in death, who deals with death all the time. Hamlet maybe can get some answers here. And that interaction that's dispassionate stops when the gravedigger says, "Whose skull do you think this is?" And Hamlet's like, "I don't know." And the gravedigger says, "A pestilence on him for a poor rogue. He poured a flagon of Rhenish on my head once." This same skull was Yorick's skull, the king's jester. That's what he says to Hamlet. Yorick was the clown of Hamlet Sr. He was the guy who was in charge of making parties laugh in Hamlet's house. And it's very clear very early here. Hamlet takes the skull in this iconic moment, and we realize Yorick was in a way a father figure to Hamlet. In a way, if you think of Hamlet's theatricality, his love of the theater, maybe Yorick is where he got that. And Hamlet is a man who's thought about death for the whole play, but now he's gazing into the hollow-eyed skull of a person he actually loved who's dead. And he says, "Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He's borne me on his back 1,000 times. Now how abhorred in my imagination it is." And I tell my students, like, this is morbid, right? But imagine someone that you know that died a while ago, looking at their skull. You know, it's difficult at open casket wakes sometimes to see the person there, and they look like themselves, and but you know they're gone, and it's, I don't know, it's discomforting and consoling. It's all of that. Hamlet's having that experience here. He says, "Here on the skull hung those lips that I've kissed I know not how oft. Where be your gibes now, your gambols, your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that used to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come, make her laugh at that." Hamlet goes to like a different place. He's not even acknowledging the gravedigger anymore. I want to point out the gravedigger won the conversation. And the only thing that stopped, I sometimes feel that Romeo and Juliet would have spoken sonnets together. They speak a sonnet together when they first meet, and that would have continued forever if the nurse didn't interrupt them. I have this thought that Hamlet would have befriended the gravedigger and they would have bantered together forever. But life doesn't let that happen. And he holds the skull of a beloved person and goes to a very different place. Suddenly, the funeral ceremony, the funeral procession for Ophelia comes. And unfortunately, because Ophelia killed herself, she's having a Christian funeral, but with great limitations. Because Laertes says to the priest, "What ceremony else? Like, what else are you going to do here for this funeral? You've done very little." And the priest says, "Her obsequies have been far enlarged as we have warranties. Her death was doubtful." You don't have to know what these words mean. If you just say "as far enlarged," like, I have done everything I can do. Laertes leaps into the grave and clutches his dead sister and says, "Pile your dust upon the quick and dead, the alive and the dead, me and Ophelia, till of this flat a mountain you have made, to o'ertop old Pelion or the skyish head of blue Olymp, pile all the dirt on us." Hamlet shows up in the most dramatic entrance you can imagine. Because you got to figure, they don't think he's going to show up here. What is he whose grief bears such an emphasis? Whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wandering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wounded hearers? This is I, Hamlet the Dane. Hamlet the Dane, he's almost making himself the king, too, as added insult. So they have this really awesome, epic fight in the grave. And it's just an incredible scene. I'm just skimming over the surface, but the philosophical conversation between the two gravediggers about the nature of death and who gets to die and get buried how, and the amazing banter between Hamlet and the gravedigger, and then this, shocking scene in the graveyard between two wrong sons, essentially, um, ends this first of two scenes in Act Five. And the question I'm wondering about, that I always like to hear people's opinions about, is that in the last few days, Hamlet has spent the entire play thinking about death. Oh, that this too solid flesh should melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. It's the first lines of his private moment in Act One, Scene Two. All on and on. But in the last several days, his life has been threatened by the king's plot to kill him and pirates. And then he gets home and he has this conversation with the gravedigger and holds the skull of a loved one and gazes into it. So my question is, how do you think Hamlet's different now than he was before he left for England? Or if you want to speculate, how do you think this scene in the graveyard will change him? Because it's, not to be morbid, but I have to say, it's one thing thinking and philosophizing about death. It's a one thing losing someone, but not being able to attend a funeral or a wake, or not holding their hand in a hospital. They just kind of, I'll be honest with you all in this reflection. My father passed of COVID in May of 2020, and none of us could be around him. So processing that death was almost abstract, right? Here, that's Hamlet. That was the case for Hamlet with his father. He wasn't there. He was in college when his father died. But now he's looked into skulls. Like, it's just, you wonder what that's going to do, right? Just on a human level. So anyway, I hope this reflection on Act Five, Scene One helps. It's my favorite scene of all of Shakespeare. Tell me what you think about it. Listen to the audio drama on YouTube, watch film versions of it. It's breathtaking. Good luck with your reading.